Hi 201 class. So what I'm going to be doing right now is going through some of the slides that we didn't have the opportunity to go through in class. I'm hoping that this will be just as informational though, and if you have any additional comments, concerns, you should feel free to ask me within the next 3 weeks, but also via email or on the comments page. So to begin, I think it would be useful if you had that packet that I distributed of all of the different sample responses in front of you, because that's essentially what we're going to be going through in this discussion. So first, an important thing to understand is the GRE writing component. There are two different kinds of responses that you can be asked for. One kind of prompt is one in which they're asking you to analyze an issue. And then the other, which I think is the more complicated one, is the one where you're being asked to analyze an argument. So we're going to look at examples of both. It's really important that you understand what they kind of want structurally. And I think in a lot of ways we think that the writing portion of the GRE should be the easiest because you don't have to study for it. But in a lot of ways, you have to study more so than the other parts of the exam. So, with that being said, this is sort of the rubric for which you're being evaluated by GRE test graders. They're interested in how you're responding to specific instructions. So in other words, do you understand what the prompt is asking you for? They want you to consider the complexities of the issue. In other words, are you understanding all sides of the issue and not just staying close to your perception? Organize, develop, and express your ideas. That's code for, are you using clear transitions, and are you reflecting in a way that goes beyond just what's in front of you, like you're doing some sort of analysis. Support your position with relevant reasons and or examples. Again, these words should be familiar to you. We were talking about how an argument is really supported by logos, which is logic, rationalizations, pathos, appeal to your reader, and ethos, using credible research, credible sources. And then control the elements of standard written English. This is really grammar and spelling. So there's no spell check on the day of the GRE, and there's also no grammar check. So it's really important that what I always recommend, you have a list of a good 500 to 750 words that you are comfortable with spelling backwards and forwards, and you pick words that can be used in a variety of different ways, and you stay true to those words when you're taking the GRE exam. Okay, so this is an example of a GRE prompt. The best ideas arise from a passionate interest in commonplace things. And then the prompt says, discuss the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement above and explain your reasoning for the position you take. In developing and supporting your position, you should consider ways in which the statement might or might not hold true and explain how those considerations shape your position. So again, this is the analyze an issue. The issue is here and we're being asked to analyze it, but we're being asked to analyze it in a very specific way. We're asked to discuss how much we agree or disagree with the statement. We're asked to explain, and you'll remember I told you about logos, pathos, and ethos, right? So this explanation needs some logos, pathos, and ethos. You're being asked to consider how this statement might not hold true or might hold true, and explain how those considerations shape your position. So this is one of the things that infuriates me about this the way that they structure prompts. What this is saying is, if you agree, make sure you explain why you possibly should disagree, and yet why you still maintain your agreement with the issue. So in other words, if I want to say this is true, in my response, I should also consider those who say, no, it's not true, and explain why, while their reasonings might seem valid, in fact, my position is the right position. So what you have then in front of you on page 5 is a sample response to this prompt that received a score of the 6. And then you also get comments of those who graded the essay explaining why they scored a 6. What I think is extremely interesting is how much outside information this student had a grasp of. He's talking about the Big Bang Theory, he's talking about Hubble, he's talking about all of these people who discovered things, and he has a clear handle on the historical information. And I think when you read this example, you might think to yourself, well, I can't write like this because I don't know the same kind of things that he knows. But I think what he does effectively that you can apply your own knowledge to is he has a clear introduction where he explains the prompt in his own words, and in fact, the introduction is on this slide here. He directly talks about passion, and he also directly answers whether or not he agrees with the prompt. And then he also immediately talks about the differences in opinions when he says it might seem like, passion won't create, or I want to get you to this part, right, where he says, after all, aren't great ideas usually marked by their extraordinary character? While this is true, their extraordinary character is as often as not directly derived from their insight into things that had theretofore gone unquestioned. While great ideas certainly can arise through seemingly pure innovation, it is nevertheless equally true that such groundbreaking thought was and is still largely a reevaluation of previous assumptions to a radical degree. So he's making this part of a conversation, or he's acknowledging the fact that there's a conversation and it's just not him talking. He understands the opposition. He gives an example that he'll use to support his argument throughout, and that all happens in the intro. Then his body paragraphs are really focused on 2 specific ideas. Again, these are general things that make the response a solid 6. And then his conclusion, he really summarizes his original point, and he highlights things that he feels the reader should have learned, and then a firm plea at the end for readers to really believe his position. And so I actually, again, this tells you how, it's a system that you can't quite figure out the mechanics of, but I really like the 5 response, which is on page 12. I thought that was a more effective response, but what do I know? So I would read through the 6 response, the 5 response, but then also read through on page 24 and 25 some of the lower responses, because I think you'll see what's really interesting is those lower responses were just really missing any sort of position, sense of what they were arguing, and also some examples. Okay. So, and this is the more complicated one, I think. This is the analyzing an argument. So here you have a sample prompt. Hospital statistics regarding people who go to the emergency room after roller skating accidents indicate the need for more protective equipment within that group of people. 75% of those who had accidents in streets or parking lots had not been wearing any protective clothing, helmet, knee pads, etc., or any light reflecting material, clip-on lights, glow-in-the-dark, wrist pads, etc. Clearly, the statistics indicate that by investing in high-quality protective gear and reflective equipment, roller skaters will greatly reduce their risk of being severely injured in an accident. And so what you're being asked to do is examine the unstated assumptions of the argument above and explain how the argument depends on the assumptions and what the implications are if the assumptions prove unwarranted. So, I don't think it's a stretch to say this is a little bit more complicated than the other prompt. 1, you have to understand what's going on here, but 2, you need to understand these words, unstated assumption, argument, and unwarranted. And that's something that I traditionally go through in a 1-2-1 class, but I want to reiterate it here so that you can, again, familiarize yourself with this terminology. So the first thing we want to do is understand how an argument works. And just as a FYI, the sample responses to this specific prompt can be found in your packet on page 33. 33 through the end of the packet. So you'll see a variety of different responses. So what makes an argument? An argument has a conclusion, what is being argued, a claim, how it is being argued, and an assumption. And that is something that is unstated, but it's required in order to buy into the argument. And I just want to, okay, so we have the example. Today is beautiful because it is sunny. So I'm telling you that it's beautiful. That's the argument. I'm claiming that it's beautiful because it is sunny, right? So the claim is it is sunny and that's why it's beautiful. The assumption is that it being sunny means it's beautiful. That is something that I am assuming readers will buy into in order to believe my larger conclusion that today is a beautiful day, right? So I'm trying to justify my argument by saying it's beautiful because it's sunny, but part of that justification means I'm also giving you some assumptions. Now, assumptions can be unwarranted, meaning they're not good, or they're not plausible, or they can be warranted assumptions. In other words, it's safe for you to assume this link, or it's safe for you to assume that yes, because it's beautiful, because it's sunny, it's beautiful. That's a safe assumption, and that's something that you really need to get comfortable with when you're answering this kind of prompt. All right. So again, when we provide a reason for a claim, we create an assumption. All arguments depend upon an assumption, one that is usually unstated. So today is beautiful because it is sunny. What is the assumption? The assumption is beautiful means sunny, right? Some might say, well, I think it's beautiful when it's raining. I said this already. Okay, so what are some assumptions that are warranted? The good kind, right? Those are assumptions where there is a slew of evidence available to support this assumption. In other words, if someone were to say, oh, you're assuming that to be true, you can respond with, no, I actually have support, and here it is. The other kind of warranted assumption is when it's something that your target audience believes to be true as well. So it's warranted. The other is a value claim that your target audience shares with you. So it's an assumption that is warranted because your target audience believes that is true as well. And so the example I have for the readily available evidence, carton of milk has a date for use within a week. I assume it will not be sour when I open it. This is warranted since I have evidence, right? I know it's not going to be sour, or I assume it's not going to be sour because it says I can use it within the week. A value claim assumption, the police will not rob us, right? I am assuming, or I'm making this argument, and I'm arguing this with the assumption that police, we know, my target audience knows, will not rob us because that's not who police are. That's a value that I'm placing on the police. Our pharmacies will not give us bogus medication. Again, I'm arguing that our pharmacies will not give us bogus medication because that's a value that we share. That's simply something that pharmacies don't do. Hopefully you're seeing, though, that this can work if you have a very specific target audience. If your target audience is not someone who trusts the police or pharmacies, then this becomes an unwarranted assumption. And so here are some more examples of unwarranted assumptions. It's something that's based on speculation. So I'll get a bus at 12:30 because buses usually come every 30 minutes in places. So I'm not really sure if it's going to come, but I feel like it will because in everywhere else, you're being speculative. You don't know that for a fact. It's not factual. Or you're basing it on evidence that you don't have. So the milk in my fridge should remain fresh for a month. When I ask you why, you don't know. So there's no evidence available. And then, like I said before, disagreement over factual matters, disagreement over value judgments. So this could easily just become unwarranted. So here are three examples of arguments, and we need to figure out what the assumptions are. So if your friend is Japanese, she must be moody. So I'm arguing that if you have a friend that's Japanese, she must be moody. What's the assumption? That all Japanese folks are moody. Now, is that a warranted one or an unwarranted one? Hopefully we're all saying unwarranted, as there is no evidence to support that. And there's also, that's really speculative. So it's kind of a mixture of like all of these. He is a good candidate for a school principal since he looks sincere. Unwarranted or warranted? Hopefully you're saying unwarranted. Well, it's tricky because it could be both depending on who you are as a person. For me, it's unwarranted because I don't agree that becoming a good candidate means just looking sincere. That's a value judgment that I disagree with. If you love her, you'll give her diamonds. Again, just a side note. You see how the dependent marker is if and there's a comma? Anyway, if you love her, you'll give her diamonds. What's the unstated assumption? That giving diamonds means love. Is it unwarranted or warranted? Now this depends on, the audience. Some audiences might say yes, that's, a value system that I agree with. Some might say no, that's a value system that I don't agree with. Okay. So that's sort of like the mechanics of assumptions, unwarranted and warranted, and that's something that you would, when you're reading your paragraph, eventually when I get to it, you would want to figure out, okay, so what are some things that this person is assuming, number one, and are these assumptions okay assumptions to make, or are they problematic? All right. Okay, so the next thing you can do, because remember, this prompt is all about poking at the actual mechanics of the argument that you're reading. The next thing you can do is talk about any logical fallacies that you see in the excerpt. And logical fallacies are really just flaws that you notice in the claims that are used to support an argument. It's sort of similar to unwarranted assumptions because one flaw in a claim is that the assumption being made is unsupported. But there are other logical fallacies that you should know that you could also use if you want to talk about how an argument is flawed. So some of the basic ones, this is called the begging the question fallacy. Active euthanasia is acceptable. It is a decent ethical thing to help another human being escape suffering through death. So in order to prove to you that active euthanasia is acceptable, I'm saying it's acceptable because it's decent, right? And so I'm assuming that what makes something acceptable, or I'm assuming rather, that euthanasia is ethical, right? And it's an unwarranted assumption because I haven't proven it. But the other thing it is it's begging the question. In other words, you have to prove that it's decent before you can prove to me that it's morally acceptable. And then the other example here is Bill and Jill. Bill says God must exist. Jill says, how do you know? Bill says, because the Bible says so. And then Jill says, why should I believe in the Bible? And Bill says, because the Bible was written by God. And so you have this back and forth, but there are still assumptions that are being made, and there are still questions that have to be answered. And so one important thing you can do when you find a fallacy like this is talk about how this impacts the validity of the overall argument. So in other words, if you find this, you can say, if we're being asked to buy into this argument because the Bible was written by God, it becomes flawed because that in itself has yet to be proven. The next kind of logical fallacy is an argument that's being made from an analogy that doesn't hold true. And the reason why it doesn't hold true is because you're comparing two things that are not at all similar. And a very common one is guns are like hammers. And so if they're both tools and they're both things that could be used to kill someone, why should we restrict one and not the other? It becomes a fallacy because guns and hammers are not at all comparable, and they're also not at all used in the same kind of way. And so again, if you find this in an argument or in your passage on the GRE, you can talk about how that's a fallacy that tears apart the whole entire argument. This one you won't really see so much on the GRE, but it's a good one to know. It's when you prove your argument by just attacking a person or persons. That's a fallacy because just because you're attacking a person doesn't mean that you've proven your argument. This you see a lot in politics. This one is one that you would see quite often on the GRE, and that's called faulty cause and effect reasoning, or post hoc ergo propter hoc. Basically saying, or the premise is, one thing happened and then after this happened, and so they're clearly related. I was doing really poorly in school, then I wore purple shoelaces, and then I did well in school. So clearly purple shoelaces make me do well in school. That's not actually a reasonable claim. It's faulty, it's a fallacy, and it's one that you can talk about. You're saying that 85% of people wore helmets, and because 85% of people wore helmets, they have 100 less accidents. But who's to say that one caused the other? And then you can list all of the other reasons that could be, that could really be why there's less accidents. Maybe there are less people on the road. Maybe there were a lot of functions. Maybe they had a road expansion, etc., etc. And these are other very plausible examples, but they're still fallacies. President Jones raised taxes and then the rate of violent crime went up, so Jones is responsible for the rise in crime. No, that's not how it works. There needs to be proof that one led to the other. It's not enough to just say one happened and then the other thing happened next. This is also a common one. I want to argue something and I think we should believe my argument because traditionally that's how it was done for years and years and years. That again is a fallacy. You can't say that just because we've done it before like this, we should continue doing it. I mean, everyone knows that 100 years ago we used to do things or not do things that we have completely different outlooks on today. So it's a fallacy. This is another common one. It's arguing something and trying to prove my argument by using emotional appeals that just are faulty. It could happen in two ways. One, the emotion that you're trying to get is irrelevant to the overall argument, or your whole argument is just on emotional appeals and there's no facts behind them. So if I'm trying to argue that I should retake a test, and then I say explain why, and the reasons why I give you are because my cat's sick, my car broke down, and I've had a cold, that's using faulty emotional appeals because it has nothing to do with your performance on the exam, right? And so you need to do more than just give me all of these other things that have happened. You need to explain to me why your performance was, or rather, you need to explain to me why, in spite of that, I should still give you that A. These are two examples, or two videos. Actually, let's watch one. No. So just stay tuned here. And so as you're watching it, pay attention to what you think the assumption is. I think it should work. All right.
Brian, what's up, Dwight? What you got in the bag? Big Mac, fries. I'll play you for it. My lunch, first one to miss, watches the other one eat. Shake on it. Got your back. Funny, Dwight. This is what we got. Between, behind, platinum, nothing but net. No jump shots. like that. Flat-footed, 540. Start there. Throw it up, double pump. Hit. Do that one. That was nice.
Okay, so in that video, and you can watch the other one as well, the argument is you should buy McDonald's, and the reason why you should buy McDonald's is these basketball players buy McDonald's and they're exceptional. The assumption is that they're exceptional because they've bought McDonald's. The other assumption is that you care about basketball players buying McDonald's, and that's the only reason why you would want McDonald's. So you'll see that there can be a number of different assumptions for any given argument. And just to break down the actual prompt for this second example, when it says examine the unstated assumptions of the argument above, they want you to really get into the argument and identify the specific claims, right? In other words, how is this argument being proven? What claims are being made to prove this argument? And within these claims, do you see any assumptions being made? So if I'm trying to prove to you that it's a beautiful day, and I prove to you it's a beautiful day by saying it's sunny, right? The claim is it's sunny, but the assumption is that because it's sunny, I should automatically assume it's a beautiful day. So you can do that talking about assumptions, but you could also expose logical fallacies. The second part is explain how the argument depends on the assumptions. This means you really need to, beyond just telling me, this is an assumption, this isn't an assumption, you need to explain, okay, if this is an unwarranted assumption, if this claim has a logical fallacy behind it, what happens to the argument? Does this part of the argument fall apart? Does the whole argument fall apart? What does it mean? Sorry, and that's really for this bullet point. This bullet point that says explain how the argument depends on the assumptions is, again, you're talking about how important was this claim to proving this argument. There are many times where a claim can be 95% of the way that the argument is proven, but there are some instances where it's just part of the argument. So you can say, well, if the argument is everyone should buy helmets, and the claim I'm making is when people bought helmets, there were less accidents, then I can say, well, I've proven that that's an unwarranted assumption because one does not necessarily lead to the other, which makes the whole entire argument invalid. The argument depends exclusively on the link between helmets and accidents. And if that's not proven, then the argument cannot be proven. So that's sort of what you would be doing in a paragraph. And then if you're thinking to yourself, how am I going to be doing this? This is a sample structure that I've created that I think works kind of well. The intro is really where you define what the argument is, and then you explain whether the argument is valid or invalid. And within this intro, you also give two reasons why you believe this. These two reasons could be the unwarranted assumption number one and the logical fallacy number two. It can be two unwarranted assumptions. It can be, if you're saying that it is valid, it can be looking at credible claim number one and credible claim number two. But you want to make that clear from the onset. And then your two body paragraphs would really just be you explaining your two reasons why it's either valid or not valid. And so the more comfortable you are with fallacies and assumptions, the more you'll have to say about why something is a fallacy and what happens when you've proven that something is a fallacy. Okay, so again, look at the examples that you have in your packet. What you have in front of you now on the screen is a sample prompt from the GRE. You don't have sample responses because what I thought would be helpful is if you want, and again, this is completely voluntary, you can take a look at this prompt, you can, rewatch this video and try to respond to this prompt. I have sample responses to this prompt that I can give you. But before I do that, though, I wanted you to try it. So this is the prompt. Discuss how well reasoned you find this argument, and the argument is given. Spend 35 minutes, because that's really what you're allotted during the GRE, to look at this, understand it, and organize a coherent answer. If you submit it before the semester ends, I will be more than happy to give you some feedback. And whether or not you decide to respond to this within the semester, I'll still give you the sample response so that when you do, you have something to compare your response to.